Have you ever felt like everything you've worked so hard to build is slipping through your fingers, as if every step taken towards success is actually a path to failure? Imagine seeing your financial life, your dreams and your achievements crumble before your eyes without being able to do anything to stop it. What would you do if, from one day to the next, you lost everything? That's exactly what happened to him. A businessman who has always believed in the power of hard work, planning, and control. But when I least expected it, everything started to fall apart. Contracts were cancelled, customers disappeared, debts grew, and what seemed like just a bad phase soon turned into despair. He tried everything: new businesses, loans, spending cuts, but nothing helped. Fear took over, loneliness became his only company, and in the midst of anguish came the question that many have already asked: has God abandoned me? If you've ever been through something similar, if you've ever felt that your strength wasn't enough and that there was no way out, then this story is for you, because what happened next shows that God never leaves us alone, even when all seems lost. And do you know what the biggest danger is? Thinking that this is just a phase, that everything will resolve itself. But the truth is that we are living in difficult times, times when many people are facing loss, uncertainty, and trials like never before. And it's no coincidence. The signs are everywhere, and those who aren't paying attention may be caught off guard. Therefore, you need to be prepared. God is speaking. He is calling us to awaken, to look beyond what the natural eyes can see. The world is changing quickly, and ignoring the signs can be costly. You cannot let routine, everyday problems, or a false sense of control prevent you from realizing what is really happening. And that's exactly why you need to stay connected with messages like this. Here, you will find words that edify, that bring direction and show that even in the darkest days, God remains in control. But this message needs to go further. Many people are still in the dark, trapped in fear and uncertainty, not knowing that there is hope, that there is a greater purpose. So if you believe that this story can transform lives, don't leave it for later. Like this video right now, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because every like, every share, every subscription makes this message reach more people. And it may be that someone right now needs to hear this so as not to give up. Don't ignore this call. Your simple gesture could be God's answer for someone today. Marcos always believed that control was in his hands. From an early age, he learned that to be successful, he had to work hard, make sacrifices, plan every detail. And that's exactly what he did. He spent years building his company, dedicating himself day and night to transforming it into a big business. The fruits of his efforts soon began to appear. Money in the account, recognition, stability. He had everything anyone would dream of: a blessed home, a united family, a promising future. Invitations to important events began to pour in. People admired him, his advice was listened to, and he felt like his life was exactly where it should be. But there was one detail that Marcos ignored. In the midst of so many achievements, the space he gave to God began to diminish. Prayers became increasingly rare, going to church became less frequent, and the trust that was once in the Lord began to be in one's own abilities. He didn't realize that little by little, he was placing his security in money, in success, in the connections he had made. After all, as long as everything was going well, why would he need to worry? He had control, right? But this false sense of security wouldn't last forever. Suddenly, without warning, everything began to change. What once seemed solid began to crumble. Small problems, which were previously easy to solve, began to accumulate. Long-time loyal customers decided to go to the competition. The economy began to oscillate, and businesses that were previously profitable started to make losses. The phone that previously didn't stop ringing with new opportunities now only brought charges, and that was when Marcos began to feel the weight of uncertainty. After all, What was going on? How could something that took years to build collapse so quickly? He tried to remain calm, to tell himself that it was just a phase, that things would soon fall into place. But deep down, a fear he had never felt began to grow. The fear of losing everything, the fear of failing, the fear of no longer being who he believed he was. And then came the harsh, cruel reality. The bills started piling up. Money, which was once abundant, began to disappear. The comfortable lifestyle had to be curtailed. First, there were the small cuts, then the big ones. The luxury car had to be sold. Trips were cancelled. Employees began to be fired one by one, and as much as he tried to hide it, his family began to notice. The concern in his wife's eyes, the children's questions. He tried to keep up appearances, to say that everything would be fine. But when he looked in the mirror, he saw a man he no longer recognized. And it was at that moment that something even deeper began to happen inside him. For the first time, Marcos felt what it felt like to be completely alone. He wondered where all those people were who once surrounded him in moments of success. Where were the friends who praised him, who invited him to meetings and dinners? He realized that when the money disappeared, many disappeared as well. And what was left was silence. A silence that screamed inside his mind, bringing to light a truth he didn't want to face. He had placed his trust in the wrong things. And here I ask you, have you ever felt this way? Have you ever had a moment when everything you knew changed from one moment to the next, and you found yourself without direction, not knowing where to run? Comment below, share your experience, because you are not alone. Many people face silent struggles and think no one would understand. But the truth is that there is a purpose in every situation, even when everything seems meaningless. What Marcos didn't yet know was that God was allowing this storm for a much greater reason. And when he thought there was no way out, that's when something unexpected happened. But this, I'll tell you in a moment. So before we continue, leave your like, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because the next part of this story could be exactly what you need to hear today. Marcos couldn't understand what was happening. Until recently, his company was prospering, his business was flowing, and he felt secure, in control. But now it seemed like everything was falling apart before his eyes, and he didn't know how to stop it. First, there were some customers who, without explanation, stopped renewing contracts. Then came a deal that he counted on as certain, but which, at the last minute, was cancelled. Small problems began to accumulate, and what was once just a nuisance soon became a nightmare. The phone rang all the time, but they weren't new opportunities, they were demands. Companies demanding payments he couldn't make, deadlines running out, interest rates rising. With each passing day, the pressure only grew. He tried to remain calm, think of a solution, but it was as if he was surrounded by a storm that wouldn't let up. Everywhere I looked, I saw problems. His bank balance was shrinking more and more. The reserves he believed would last began to run out quickly. And then came the scariest moment. He realized he had nowhere else to run. Marcos tried to solve everything himself. He cut expenses, laid off employees, renegotiated deadlines. He clung to the hope that this difficult phase would soon pass, that the market would improve, that a big contract would come along to save his business. But nothing happened. With each attempt to recover, he sank further. Like a man fighting the current, each movement seemed to only take him deeper. The nights became long. He couldn't sleep. Whether due to anxiety or the weight of responsibility crushing his shoulders, he simply spent hours staring at the ceiling, feeling his heart racing and his thoughts racing. What if I lose everything? How will I support my family? How will I pay the bills? How am I going to look in the mirror and face failure? Fear took over. He, who had always been a confident man, began to doubt himself, and even worse, he began to doubt God. Where was the Lord at that moment? He had been faithful throughout his journey. He had built everything with effort and dedication. Why did it now seem like God was silent? That was the question that echoed in his mind, but he had no answers. All he felt was emptiness, a sense of abandonment, the hardest. Day came when he received a formal warning. If he didn't pay a specific debt by the end of the week, he would lose a significant part of his assets. He read that document several times, but the words seemed blurry. His heart raced. It was as if the ground had been ripped out from under his feet. He tried to think of a plan, make calls, find a way out. But for the first time, he realized there was nothing else he could do. It was then that despair set in once and for all. Marcos locked himself in the office without the strength to face his wife and children. He didn't want them to see him like that. He spent hours sitting, staring into space, trying to understand how his life had gotten to that point. The man who was once admired for his strength and vision now stood there, not knowing what to do, completely lost. And maybe you've already been through something similar. Maybe you've already felt that feeling of helplessness, of seeing everything get out of your control without being able to stop it. Perhaps you asked yourself, as Marcos asked himself at that moment, what now? What do I do? If you have ever faced a moment of crisis so great that it made you even doubt your ability to move forward, share it here in the comments. Your story might help someone who is also going through this right now. But what Marcos didn't know is that when we think everything is lost, God already has a plan. And sometimes He allows us to hit rock bottom, not to destroy us, but to teach us something we would never learn otherwise. And that's exactly what happened to Marcos. But this part of the story, I'll tell you now. So, before we continue, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and activate the bell, because what comes next could completely change the way you see difficult moments in life. Marcos felt like he was trapped in a nightmare from which he couldn't wake up. Everything he had built with years of effort seemed to crumble before his eyes. And no matter how hard he tried, nothing worked. He did everything he could to avoid the worst. He sought loans from banks, tried to negotiate with creditors, made cuts to the company's budget, and reduced personal expenses to a minimum. But nothing was enough. The debts were too big, and the doors seemed to close every time he tried a new solution. At first, he still had hope. I thought it was just a difficult period, that everything would soon stabilize. But as the days passed and the situation only worsened, he began to sink into an anguish he had never experienced before. The phone rang constantly, but he already knew what was coming on the other end of the line. Charges. Creditors didn't want any more promises. They wanted money, and he hadn't. With each call he answered, his voice became more shaky. He tried to explain, tried to ask for more time, but no one wanted to listen. To them, he was just another number, another overdue bill. And it wasn't just at work that the impact was felt. Inside the house, the atmosphere began to change. Marcos's wife tried to support him, but he saw the concern in her eyes. He noticed her whispers on the phone, her low conversations about overdue bills, about the money that was no longer enough for basic expenses. His children noticed something was wrong. They no longer asked for anything. They didn't ask about trips. They didn't ask for gifts. They felt the weight of the crisis, even if no one spoke directly about it. Shame began to consume him. He, who had always been seen as a successful man, now found himself bankrupt. He looked at the people around him and wondered what they were thinking. Did they whisper about him? Did they laugh behind your back? Did they wait to see how far it would sink? He started avoiding the places he used to frequent. He stopped answering calls from friends. He refused invitations. Every day he closed himself more within himself. And then came the final blow. Bankruptcy was declared. That word, which he never imagined would one day be part of his history, was now there, stamped on official documents. There was no turning back. What was once just a fear was now an inescapable reality. Marcos lost everything. The company he built with so much effort no longer existed. What was once his greatest pride was now just ruins. That day, he sat on the floor of the empty office, looking around. The shelves were empty. The chairs, which had previously been occupied by employees and customers, were now covered in an overwhelming silence. The computers were off. Everything was over. Marcos felt a lump in his throat, but he couldn't cry. He was dry inside, exhausted, without the strength to even feel sadness. He returned home, but it was no longer the same home as before. Everything looked different. He locked himself in his room and stayed there for hours, staring into space. His heart was heavy. His mind was in complete chaos. Questions arose non-stop. Where did I go wrong? Why did this happen to me? Now what do I do? But above all these questions, there was one that hurt more than all the others. Where is God? Marcos was raised in a family of faith. He knew that God existed. He knew that God was powerful. But at that moment, he couldn't feel anything. The silence was overwhelming. He expected an answer, a sign, a direction. But all he heard was the echo of his own thoughts. He felt abandoned, alone, aimless. If you've ever felt that sense of failure, if you've ever experienced a moment when everything you knew fell apart and you didn't know what to do, then you know what Marcos was experiencing. And maybe like him, you've asked yourself, does God really care about me? If this question has already crossed your mind, write it in the comments, share your story, because the truth is, many people are struggling silently with no one to listen. But today, you can find an answer. The night was dark and silent. Marcos felt the weight of failure crushing his shoulders. The silence in the room only made the noise in your mind louder, where desperate thoughts echoed without control. He was staring at the ceiling, but his vision was blurry. What would happen to him now? Where would you go? How would his family survive? There were no answers. There were no more solutions. Everything he tried failed. His intelligence, his strength, his contacts. Nothing was enough. He felt like a boat adrift, without a rudder, without direction. The feeling of being alone was suffocating. But it wasn't just physical loneliness. It was something much deeper. It was as if a void was growing inside him, a black hole sucking in everything that had once made him feel safe. He had no more money, no more company, no more prospects, and the only thing left was an overwhelming pain in his chest. Then, for the first time in a long time, Marcos allowed himself to cry. Not discreet tears, not restrained crying. It was a deep cry. An outpouring of accumulated years, of repressed frustrations, of a soul tired of fighting alone. He fell to his knees on the cold bedroom floor, unable to stand up. There was nothing more to do. Everything he thought he could control slipped through his fingers like sand, and it was there, on the ground, in his darkest moment, that something inside him broke. For the first time, Marcos understood that he did not have control. That your life was never, in fact, in your hands. And in that moment, amidst the tears and sobs, he did something he had never really done. He cried out, "Lord, if there is still a purpose for me, show me the way." That prayer didn't come from the mind. It wasn't a rehearsed speech. It was a cry from the soul, a sincere cry from someone who no longer had anything to offer, just his pain, his despair, his surrender. Marcos, who spent his entire life believing he was strong enough to face any obstacle, now stood before God like a helpless boy, asking for help. And then something happened. It wasn't an audible response. It wasn't an instant solution. But in the midst of all the anguish, something he hadn't felt in a long time began to fill his heart. Peace. It was a strange peace, a peace that made no sense because nothing had changed externally. He was still broke. He still didn't know what he would do the next day. He still had accumulated bills and unresolved uncertainties. But somehow he felt that God was there, that God heard him, and that was enough to make his heart calm down. Marcos remained kneeling for a long time, feeling his heart slow down, his mind empty. The feeling of helplessness was still there, but at the same time, there was something different. He didn't know what would happen the next day, but for the first time in a long time, he no longer felt like he was alone. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and deep down in his being, he knew something was about to change. Marcos remained kneeling on the ground for a long time. His body was tired, his mind exhausted, but inside him, there was something different, a peace he couldn't explain. Nothing around him had changed. The debts continued, the uncertainties still hovered over his life. But at that moment, for the first time in a long time, he felt that he was no longer alone. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and deep down in his being, he knew something was about to happen. The next morning, the alarm clock rang, but Marcos was already awake. He spent the night awake, no longer dominated by despair, but reflecting on his prayer. He stood up without knowing exactly what to do, but there was a certainty in his heart. God had heard his cry. He didn't know how or when, but he felt an answer was on the way. Still sitting on the bed, he looked at his cell phone on the nightstand. The device had been silent for days. Nobody called anymore. Nobody asked how he was. All the contacts he had at the height of his success seemed to have disappeared at the moment of his ruin. But at that moment, the phone vibrated. Marcos looked at the screen and was surprised by the number that appeared. It wasn't one of the creditors he already knew. It wasn't a bank, nor a collector. There was something different, he answered, with a hesitant voice. On the other end of the line, a familiar voice, a longtime friend, someone who, in the midst of the turmoil, he no longer even remembered existed. This friend had heard about your situation and wanted to meet you. Marcos's heart accelerated. He could hardly believe anyone still cared. He arranged the meeting without thinking twice. Hours later, sitting in a simple cafe, Marcos saw that familiar face approaching. His friend smiled and gave him a big hug, a gesture Marcos hadn't felt in a long time. They talked for a long time. For the first time, he unburdened himself without fear. He told everything that happened, the losses, the disappointments, the bankruptcy, the sleepless nights. His friend listened attentively, without interrupting. When Marcos finished, he felt a weight lift off his back. Then something unexpected happened. His friend told him there was an opportunity. Nothing grand, nothing that would solve all your problems immediately, but a first step, a job, something simple but worthy, something that would give him a fresh start. Marcos hesitated for a moment. He, who previously ran his own company, was now faced with the chance to start again in a completely different way. But this time, there was something new in his heart, humility. He realized that everything that happened was not by chance. God was teaching him something. He understood that he no longer needed to carry everything alone, that he no longer needed to rely solely on his own strength. He accepted the opportunity, and at that moment I knew that this was the first step towards something much bigger, because more than a new job, more than a way to start over, Marcos had received something that no money could buy: direction, peace, the certainty that God was in control, and he knew that from then on, nothing would be the same. Marcos accepted that opportunity without knowing exactly where it would lead him. He no longer had grandiose ambitions, no longer seeking to regain status, luxury, or recognition. His heart no longer yearned for what once defined his worth. Now he just wanted to start over. Each day was a new chance, each step a learning experience. He understood that his journey had not been in vain. God had allowed him to pass through the valley so that his vision would be transformed. Failure, which had previously seemed like a punishment, now began to reveal itself as a necessary detour, a route that took him to a destination he would never have chosen on his own. The job he accepted seemed small for someone who had already run a company, made big decisions, and dealt with million-dollar figures. But for him, it was more than a job. It was an answer. It was a new beginning, and he decided to embrace it with a gratitude. He realized that even in the simplest tasks, God was teaching him something: humility, patience, the ability to see beyond yourself. And it was like this, in the middle of this new path, that something surprising began to happen. Marcos started to connect with people who faced difficulties similar to those he experienced. People who had lost everything, who were afraid of the future, who saw no way out. And, without realizing it, he began to advise them, to share his story, to offer a shoulder to lean on. He spoke of his despair, of his bankruptcy, but he also spoke of the night he fell to his knees and cried out to God. He talked about the emptiness he felt, but also about the peace that came when he finally surrendered. People listened, got emotional, identified. Many of them had never spoken to someone who understood exactly what they were feeling. Over time, he realized his words had an impact. He began to see that his pain was not just meaningless suffering. God was. Using her story to restore other lives. He understood that his mission was never just to build a financial empire, but to touch hearts, bring hope, and be an instrument of transformation. Bankruptcy was not the end. It was the beginning of something much bigger. And here I ask you, have you ever gone through a difficult moment that later turned out to be God's greater plan? Have you ever experienced a situation that seemed like the end, but that, in the end, took you down a path you never imagined? Share your story in the comments. Your testimony can inspire and strengthen anyone who needs a word of hope today. How many times do we find ourselves trying to solve everything on our own, believing that success depends only on our effort, our intelligence, our ability to plan every detail? We spend our entire lives building something, believing that we are in control, until suddenly everything is out of our hands. And at that moment, when we see ourselves with no way out, we feel fear, frustration, and a suffocating feeling of failure. But are we really alone? Does God abandon us in the most difficult times, or does He allow us to come to the end of ourselves so that we can finally see that we have always depended on Him? Mark's story shows us something powerful. He needed to lose everything to understand that his confidence was in the wrong place. He had to hit rock bottom to discover that God never abandoned him, that the purpose of his life was much greater than he imagined. Bankruptcy was not a punishment but a calling. God used pain to shape him, to make him grow, to lead him to a new path where his true mission was revealed. What seemed like the end was actually a new beginning. What if what you are experiencing now is not the end, but rather the beginning of something new? What if this pain, this crisis, this difficult phase is, in fact, God calling you to something greater? Maybe you are wondering why certain things are happening in your life. Maybe you feel like you're losing control and that everything is falling apart. But know one thing, God already has a path prepared. You may not see it now, you may not understand it, but He is working behind the scenes. Your story does not end at the moment of pain. Now think about it. Have you ever surrendered your life completely into God's hands? Have you allowed yourself to stop fighting alone and trust that He has a perfect plan for you? Because, like Marcos, you may discover that what seems like a defeat may, in fact, be the greatest opportunity for transformation in your life. God did not create you to live trapped in fear, anxiety, doubt. He has a purpose for everything, and when you decide to truly trust, you will realize that you were never alone. If this story touched your heart, if you felt that God spoke to you through this video, don't leave without taking action. Subscribe to the channel now to continue following messages that strengthen faith and bring hope. Here, you will never be alone. There will always be a word from God to guide you through difficult times. And if you made it to the end of this video, I want to know which part of this story impacted you the most. Comment below. I trust in God's purpose so that I know you were here, and together we can spread this message of faith to more people. This story showed that God always has a purpose, even when everything seems lost. And there is something even more powerful that you need to know. Often, what stops us from living this purpose is not difficulties, but our own choices. In the next video, you will understand how small decisions can completely change the course of your life and how God acts in details that, at first glance, seem insignificant. Get ready for a revelation that could transform the way you see challenges.